The winter of 1878 arrived early in the frozen valleys, and while families stacked fuel and sealed their shutters, Jacob, gray-bearded, stooped, and clutching a blackened ox horn, walked through the village carrying a live coal wrapped in nothing but ash. The townsfolk shook their heads. Matches existed. It was a dying art, a stubborn ghost. But in the heavy stillness before a blizzard no one saw coming, not a single soul realized that the fate of every fire in town would soon depend on that one glowing, nearly forgotten ember. Jacob was the last fire carrier in Bitter Creek, a village that had traded pioneer grit for matchboxes and kerosene. The blackened ox horn came from his grandfather, lined with birch ash, kept smoldering through winters that had killed lesser men. The townsfolk saw him as a relic, an old fool carrying a live coal nobody needed. But on the 7th of December, 1878, an ice storm fell like a hammer. Drenched matches turned to paste. Stoves went cold. Chimneys froze solid. And the only flame left alive in the valley was the one Jacob cradled inside that horn, the ember they had mocked, now the only thing standing between the village and a frozen grave. The knowledge inside that horn stretched back generations, long before matches and kerosene turned fire into something cheap. Jacob's grandfather, Elias Knecht, had been a woodcutter in the Black Forest before crossing the ocean with nothing but an axe, a flint straker, and a hollowed cow horn packed with birch ash. The horn was his lifeline. In the old country, carrying live coals from house to house was a sacred duty, a trade passed from father to son, learned in the dark winters of Saxony. A fire carrier did not merely preserve a flame, he carried the hearth, the one constant of domestic survival. Elias taught Jacob's father, and Jacob's father taught him, in the thin air of a rocky mountain trapping camp, how to line the horn with fine sifted ash so the coal nestled inside without smothering or flaring, how to breathe on it just once every 2 hours to keep the heart of the ember alive, how to cradle the horn against the belly when walking against the wind, so the coal felt the heat of life and never went cold. That art had lit the first hearth in Bitter Creek 30 winters before. It lit every hearth in the earliest years, when matches were a rare luxury and wind-lashed kindling tested the patience of even the toughest homesteaders. But technology swallowed tradition in a single generation. By 1878, a general store stood in the middle of town, its shelves stacked with boxes of lucifer matches shipped by rail. Kerosene lanterns hung from porch beams. People kept tinderboxes, but they had forgotten the rhythms of the horn. Fire was no longer a creature to be coaxed and guarded. It was a commodity. So the town looked at Jacob and his ash-blackened horn as a curiosity, a walking museum. Children giggled and called him the Coal Man. Matrons smiled tight smiles behind rain-streaked windows. The men at the livery stable would say, "Matches exist, Jacob," slapping their thighs at the joke. He never answered. He just kept walking, eyes on the trail ahead, the horn cradled against his coat like something far more valuable than anyone around him could understand. But there were older folks who remembered. Widow Hester Brindle, whose husband had died in a flash freeze that swallowed an entire hunting party, who had seen Jacob's father bring fire to her doorstep when her tinder was drenched and her baby was blue with cold, watched the old man pass each morning. And each morning she lowered her head a fraction of an inch, almost imperceptible. Respect, or perhaps remembrance of a debt that could never be repaid. Others dismissed even that as sentiment. The winter of 78 was supposed to be like any other, hard but manageable. The almanac predicted a mild season. New families had settled in the valley, confident in their modern gear. They didn't know that the worst storms on the frontier came from warm fronts colliding with Arctic air in exactly the wrong way. They didn't know that a single night of freezing rain could encase every piece of kindling, every match head, every axe handle in a thick shell of ice that would make a man feel foolish for ever trusting a box of chemicals. The storm arrived just before dusk on the 6th of December, not with snow, but with a heavy, soaking rain that fell into a temperature already plummeting. Within 2 hours, the rain turned to pellets, then to a fine clinging glaze that coated every surface, Tree limbs, fence wires, roof shingles, the very air itself seemed to turn solid. By midnight, the village was locked inside a crystalline prison. Fires that had been burning low at bedtime were still warm but suffocating under frozen chimneys, the draft killed by ice-clogged flues. And in the terrible silence that followed the rain, people woke to a world that cracked with every step. Matches, when they could be found, were damp. The ones that looked dry would strike, spark, and then fizzle against the wet air. Stoves that had served families for years sat cold and dead, their iron grates beaded with ice. Kerosene froze to a cloudy gel. One by one, the households of Bitter Creek discovered they had no flame, no heat, and with the temperature sinking below zero, no time. Jacob had spent the night awake, as he always did during a freeze. He sat in his small cabin at the edge of town, the horn on his lap, a single oil lamp burning low. Every 2 hours he lifted the wick, placed his mouth near the horn's mouth, and gave it a slow, steady breath. The coal glowed a deeper red for a moment, then settled back to orange. He listened to the storm change shape. When the ice began to crack poplar branches outside, he knew. He pulled on his heaviest wool coat, wrapped a scarf over his beard, and tucked the horn beneath the folds of fabric against the warmth of his chest. He did not grab a lantern. The coal itself was his light and his compass. Then he stepped out the door into a world no longer made of earth and wood, but of glass. The first house he approached belonged to the Millers, a young couple with a 2-year-old son. He could hear the baby crying inside before he even knocked. When the door swung open, the husband stood there wild-eyed, a broken box of wet matches scattered at his feet. He looked at the old man, then at the horn. For a long moment he said nothing. The air between them shimmered with frost and desperation. Jacob met his gaze and asked a single question. "Is your stove flue clear?" The man nodded, speechless. Jacob knelt by the cold hearth, carefully tipped the horn, and let a pebble-sized ember tumble onto a prepared nest of shredded bark and dry splinters. He breathed, once, twice. The flame caught, small and tentative, then grew. As the fire began to crackle, he turned toward the open door without waiting for thanks. Behind him, the young mother sobbed once, a sound caught between terror and relief. Jacob stepped back into the ice-bound darkness and lifted the horn again. There were 20 more homes still frozen and silent, and the coal in his hand had grown a little smaller. How many houses could one ember save? He didn't know. And the real weight in his chest that night was not the cold. It was the creeping certainty that at some point the fire in his hands would have to choose which life to spare. The ice crackled beneath Jacob's boots with every step, a sound like thin bones snapping. He did not hurry. Hurried men stumble, and a stumble could crack the horn, scatter the ash, kill the coal. He moved at a measured pace, the horn tucked inside his open coat, his breath forming a cloud that joined the frozen mist hanging over Bitter Creek. Ahead, the dark shapes of cabins squatted against the night, their windows not glowing with hearth light but blank and cold as grave markers. The village he had walked through for 40 winters looked like a place already dead. Widow Hester's door opened before he could knock. She stood in the frame, a small woman wrapped in 3 layers of patched wool, a beeswax candle stub flickering in her hand. Her eyes went first to the horn, then to his face. "I've kept the tinder dry under my bed," she said. "I knew you'd come." Her voice carried no surprise, only the settled certainty of someone who had seen this rhythm before, who remembered what the others had forgotten. Jacob stepped inside, knelt by the hearth, and tipped a single glowing fragment onto the shaved birch bark she had prepared. As the flame caught, her hands found his shoulder. The grip, frail but fierce, held him there for a moment. "My husband," she whispered, "did not freeze because of your father." Then she let go, and Jacob was back in the ice, the horn's weight a little lighter, the coal a little smaller. He counted 23 homes in Bitter Creek, including the ones farthest out, near the sawmill and the frozen creek bend. The Miller house was one. Hester's made 2. He had carried one ember the size of a hen's egg when he left his cabin. Now, after only 2 transfers, its edges had already shrunk to the size of a walnut. The math was simple and brutal. Each kitchen stove required a fragment large enough to ignite shavings, then catch kindling, then live long enough to push heat into the room before the lamp oil froze again. Too small an ember and the flame would sputter and die before the wood could grip it. Too large and he would deplete the coal before he reached half the homes. He stepped back onto the footpath and heard, through the crystalline silence, a distant pounding, someone thrashing an axe against a frozen woodpile, the strokes frantic, ineffective. He turned left toward the sound. The old sawmill road was worse. Freezing rain had sheeted every rock and root into a single smooth, treacherous glaze. Jacob had to test each step with the toe of his boot before committing his weight. Twice he stopped dead, heart thumping, as the horn shifted against his ribs. The coal's heat, which had been a steady presence, now felt intermittent, fluttering. He paused beneath the overhang of a split-rail fence, cupped the horn's mouth and breathed into it, slow, steady, the way his grandfather taught. The glow deepened from dull orange to a brief, nervous red, then settled. He could almost hear the old man's voice. Don't crowd it. Don't starve it. Just keep it company. He was keeping company right now, but the coal was tired. It had been burning for over 40 hours straight, and embers, like people, did not live forever on air alone. The pounding came from the Blakely cabin, where a young logger named Ward Blakely had spent the last half hour swinging a dull axe head against a frozen pile of split pine. His wife, Clementine, stood on the porch with their baby wrapped inside a grain sack, her face pale as bone china. When Jacob appeared out of the dark, Ward dropped the axe and nearly wept. I struck 100 matches, he said, his voice cracked. The box is soaked. The wood might as well be stone. Jacob looked at the pile. The logs glistened under a quarter-inch of clear ice. He picked up a split piece, turned it in his hands, then tapped the ice shell with the blunt end of his knife. It fractured into 1,000 glittering shards, and beneath, the pine was dry. The wood inside is fine, he said. The ice sealed it like a jar. You just need heat that lasts longer than a match head. He tipped the horn, gave them a fragment, and watched the young father nurse the flame with the desperation of a man who had just learned that nature did not care about new inventions. But as he turned to leave, something else caught his attention. A murmur of voices coming from the center of town, near the general store. Not panic exactly. Something colder. Disbelief. A crowd had gathered in the wide space between the store and the chapel. 15 or 20 people huddled around a single fire barrel that someone had managed to light by sacrificing nearly an entire bottle of lamp oil. The barrel burned bright, but it was a hungry, wasteful fire gulping fuel, giving nothing back. Standing near it was Ezra Bledsoe, the storekeeper, the very man who had sold matches by the gross to the whole valley. He was speaking loudly, a defensive edge in his voice. I didn't manufacture the matches, he was saying. They're a good product. It's not my fault the weather turned ugly. Beside him, the town preacher, a gaunt man named Reverend Plimpton, looked at the crowd with growing unease. He saw Jacob approaching, the horn still glowing, and his expression flickered, annoyance, then recognition of a tool he could use. Jacob, the Reverend called, his voice carrying an authority that didn't quite fit the situation. You still have that old thing. I'd say the Lord has given you the means to be a blessing tonight. He gestured broadly at the shivering families. The words were pious, but the tone was a command disguised as a prayer. Jacob said nothing. He did not move toward the barrel. He walked instead to the door of the general store, where Ezra's own house attached to the back. The storekeeper's wife, Myra, stood there, arms crossed, eyes rimmed red. Her stove was dead too, and her husband hadn't been able to fix it. Jacob looked at Ezra, then at the store window, its shelves still stocked with trade goods, canned peaches, bridle bits, one full crate of unopened matchboxes, their sulfur tips useless in this frozen sea. You have kindling inside, Jacob said. Bundles of shaved cedar from the mill, you sell them for a nickel. Ezra's jaw tightened. He knew where this was going. That cedar's good dry fuel, but it won't light itself. Jacob let the silence stretch long enough for everyone to understand. Then he tilted the horn and caught the storekeeper's gaze. Bring out the cedar, I'll give you fire, but after tonight you don't sell matches, you learn to carry. That moment, a new kind of quiet fell over the crowd. It was not the quiet of helplessness. It was the quiet of people watching a debt come due. They had laughed at the coal man. They had let their children mock him. Now the one flame left in the valley was held by the hands they had dismissed. And Jacob, tired old man, was not simply handing out charity. He was making a trade, not for money, for legacy. The art that was dying, the art he had been born to preserve, would not die tonight. It would either pass forward or extinguish with him. And every face around that barrel understood it, perhaps for the first time, that the fire he carried was not a relic of the past. It was a lease on the future. He gave Myra Bledsoe a fragment from the horn, and the storekeeper's wife lit her own stove with a steadiness that betrayed old practice she had nearly forgotten. Then Ezra, humbled, lugged the bundles of cedar shavings into the street, and Jacob began to portion out fire. But the coal in the horn was now barely the size of a cherry pit. He could not make the rounds alone and hope to reach the families at the far end. It was then that a boy stepped from the crowd. Benny Caulfield, no more than 13, son of a trapper who had died of a bad lung fever the year before. His mother, a seamstress, stood behind him, her eyes wide with protest that she did not speak aloud. The boy's face was smudged with soot from a failed attempt to light his own home stove. He met Jacob's eyes. "Teach me," he said. "Not the whole thing, just enough to carry it to the houses by the creek. I won't let it die." Jacob studied him. 50 winters of knowledge pressed against his ribs, and the horn in his hands grew heavier. This was the pivot his grandfather never had to make, trusting fire to a boy with soft hands who had grown up believing matches were the only source of flame. If the boy failed, the ember would be lost, and the families along the creek would freeze. But if he never taught anyone, the art died with him anyway. The storm had already proven that modern tools could fail. What could one old man do against a world that had forgotten him? He could teach. He knelt in the icy mud of the street, pulled a second, smaller horn from his pack, a spare he always carried, unused, carved from the same ox, lined with the same ash, and scraped a glowing half of the remaining ember into its bowl. He placed it into the boy's cupped hands. "Hold it against your heart," Jacob said quietly. "Every quarter hour, breathe into it once lightly like you're cooling soup. If the coal starts to pale, find a twig no thicker than your finger and touch it to the ember to feed a little smoke." The boy's hands trembled, but his eyes held steady. "What if I fail?" he asked. Jacob closed the boy's fingers over the horn. "Then tonight you learn why your grandfather and mine never trusted a new invention alone. And if you succeed, you'll teach someone else tomorrow. That's how this works." The crowd watched in silence as the boy and his mother set off into the dark toward the creek homes, the smaller horn now a fragile beacon bobbing through the frozen mist. Jacob watched them until the glow was no bigger than a firefly, then turned toward the remaining houses on the opposite road. His horn held an ember no larger than a pea now, perhaps enough for one more house, maybe two. And then the teacher would have no fire left, and the student would be the only other flame in the valley. As he trudged toward the Hanson cabin, where a farmer's wife was expecting a child any hour, a new sound sliced through the crystal air. Not the pound of an axe, not the murmur of the crowd, but a long, low crack that could only mean one thing in an ice storm. A tree limb, heavy with frozen weight, had snapped and fallen. It came from the direction of the creek road, exactly where the boy had gone. The wind stirred for the first time since the rain ended, a razor blade of air that cut through wool and hope alike. Jacob stopped, his heart hammering against the horn. The ember in his own hand suddenly felt colder. If that branch had struck the boy, the other horn could be shattered, the second ember lost. And if that happened, half the village would lose its last chance at fire. He had sent a child into the dark with the entire weight of a town's survival, and now the dark had answered back. The crack echoed across the frozen valley, a sound like a rifle shot muffled by ice. Jacob's hand tightened on his own horn, the pea-sized ember inside suddenly feeling as fragile as a heartbeat. The Hanson cabin lay ahead, its chimney a dark stub against the white sky, but his feet had stopped moving. Down the creek road, where the boy had gone, there was no light, only the aftering of the fallen limb and the low moan of wind through ice-glazed pines. For 10 full seconds, Jacob stood motionless. He could turn back now, abandon the Hanson farm, retrace his steps, find the boy, salvage whatever might remain. But the Hanson wife was due any hour. If her hearth stayed cold through labor, both mother and child could die before morning. The calculus of triage, the same brutal math he had faced leaving the Miller cabin, now compressed into a single, irreconcilable choice: forward to a guaranteed life saved, or sideways into the dark for a chance to rescue two. He chose forward. Not because the boy meant less, but because Jacob had learned decades ago that a fire carrier could not chase every echo. You trust what you taught, or you never teach at all. He wrapped the horn closer against his ribs, breathed into it once, and pushed on toward the Hanson door. Inside, the scene was worse than any he had found yet. Marta Hanson lay on a pallet near the cold stove, her face slick with sweat despite the freezing air. Her husband, Nels, a wheat farmer with hands like shovel blades, knelt beside her, wrapping blankets that were already stiffening with frost. The midwife, an old Crow woman named Bird Singing, was crushing herbs into a bowl with a stone pestle. She looked up as Jacob entered, her dark eyes sharp and unsurprised. "The baby is turned wrong," she said. "I need hot water, warm cloths, and a fire to keep her strength. Without heat I cannot work." Jacob didn't speak. He crossed to the stove, found the tinder box dry but useless with no ignition, and tipped the horn. The ember, now barely the size of a split lentil, tumbled onto the shavings. He breathed. The flame caught, small and blue at the base, then yellow. Nels moved immediately, feeding kindling, then larger splits, his huge hands trembling. Within minutes, a pot of snow began to melt on the stovetop, and Bird Singing set to work with calm efficiency born of too many hard births. But Jacob, watching the fire take hold, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. That ember had been the last. The horn was now empty, a hollow vessel of ash and dead air. The coal that had lived through 3 storms, 40 hours, and 5 household fires had finally given itself entirely. He was 30 minutes' walk from his own cabin in the brutal cold, with no flame to shield him, no living ember to nurture. If the boy had failed, there would be no more fire in Bitter Creek to share. The mission was complete, and now he was just an old man standing in the dark, with nothing left to carry but the empty horn of his grandfather. He left the Hanson cabin silently, the sounds of the midwife's commands fading behind him. The wind had risen, not a blizzard wind but a steady, bitter draft that sifted ice crystals off the trees and drove them sideways into exposed flesh. Jacob pulled his scarf higher, felt the sting on his cheeks, and started the long walk toward the creek road. He had to know. The road was a tunnel of shattered trees. Branches lay across the path, some thick as a man's thigh, their broken ends jagged with frozen sap. Jacob climbed over them slowly, his old knees protesting, the empty horn bumping against his chest. In the darkness ahead, a flicker, no, 2 flickers. The first was the pale, wavering glow of a horn. The second was larger, a window lit from within, the warm square of a hearth fire burning steady. He rounded the final bend and saw the Caulfield cabin standing intact, smoke curling from its chimney, and on the porch, sitting with the small horn still cupped in his hands, was Benny Caulfield. He was not dead, he was not even hurt. A branch had fallen, yes, a massive limb from an old cottonwood, but it had crashed into the frozen creek bed, a dozen yards short of the path. The sound had traveled, but the danger had passed. The boy looked up as Jacob approached, his face streaked with soot and frozen sweat, but his eyes bright with an emotion that had no room for fear, pride. "I fed it a twig," he said, holding up the horn. "Like you taught me, it didn't go out." And in that moment something shifted in Jacob that had not shifted in 40 winters. The art had not died. It had passed from withered hands to young ones, imperfectly, nervously, but alive. He sat down heavily on the porch step beside the boy, breathing hard, the empty horn now a hollow weight that felt strangely light. "You'll teach your mother," Jacob said after a long pause. "Tomorrow, and Hester will teach the Millers, and by spring I want 10 horns in this valley." Benny nodded solemnly, and the small horn glowed between them like a promise. But the night was not over, and the storm had one more cruelty to unleash. From the far side of the village, near the sawmill, a new sound rose, a dull, percussive boom, followed by a cascade of cracking wood. The ice load on the old sawmill roof had reached a breaking point. The structure, already leaning from years of neglect, collapsed inward with a roar that shook the frozen ground. And inside that mill, stored in the back shed away from the main blade, was the village's entire winter fuel reserve. 200 cords of cut and split pine, stacked and covered with canvas. Without that wood, even a lit fire would starve. Jacob's body went rigid. He had saved the hearths, but now the fuel itself was buried under a mountain of splintered timber and glazing ice. Word spread through the village faster than the cold. Families standing by their newly lit stoves heard the collapse and felt the tremor. One by one, they wrapped themselves and stumbled out into the darkness, carrying lanterns lit from Jacob's distributed flame, their faces illuminated with a dawning horror. They had fire tonight, but what would they burn tomorrow? The coal could travel from house to house, but coal could not ignite a log that was pinned beneath a frozen ruin, not without hands and axes and hours of work. And the temperature was still dropping. Ezra Bledsoe, the storekeeper, found Jacob near the creek road and spoke with a quaver in his voice that had nothing to do with the cold. "That's all the milled wood," he said. "The reserve, the surplus, everything I was going to sell through the rest of winter. It's under there now. Even if we clear it, half will be rotted from ice melt by the time we dig it out." Jacob stared toward the dark shape of the collapsed mill, then back at the sky. The wind had begun to shift again, turning northerly, and he could smell more snow coming. Hard snow, the kind that buried men who lingered too long. This was the worst turn, not the lack of matches, not the mockery of the town, not even the near loss of the boy. This was the moment when even the ancient art of carrying fire could not replace the brute physical reality of fuel. Jacob could teach 100 boys to cradle an ember, but if there was nothing left to burn, then the hearths would still go cold. The storm had won after all, not by blowing out flames, but by crushing the very source of them. Yet the frontier had a rule: when machinery failed, muscle substituted. And when muscle was not enough, community had to fill the gap. Jacob turned to the growing crowd, now 30 or 40 strong, many of them holding shovels and axes they had grabbed on instinct. "You have fire," he said, raising his voice against the wind. "That means you have light and you have warmth to fight through the night. I want every able body at the mill, not to clear the whole pile, that'll take weeks, but to open a single path to the fuel reserve. We only need a few hours. Work in shifts. Warm yourselves at the fires you just lit. And if you can't dig, you haul. If you can't haul, you hold lanterns. But no one stands still. Standing still is how you freeze." They listened. Not because he was the oldest or the wisest, but because he had become, in the space of a few hours, the man who had not been wrong about a single thing. The ridicule of years evaporated in the face of survival. The same men who had laughed at his horn now looked to it as the only symbol of continuity in a world falling apart. The rescue of the fuel reserve became a feverish, communal labor. Lanterns ringed the collapsed mill, their pooled light casting long shadows. Teams of 4 would dig at the frozen wreckage until their fingers numbed, then retreat to a barrel fire lit from one of the new hearth flames, while fresh teams took their place. The boy Benny worked alongside the men, dragging smaller pieces of broken timber with a rope harness someone threw together. Widow Hester, too old to lift beams, organized a rotation of hot tea brewed over her own stove, carried in tin cups to the workers. By the deepest hour of the night, they had cleared a narrow tunnel through the debris, and the first intact cord of pine was dragged free to cheers that dissolved into exhausted silence. The big moment, the wait, it gets bigger, realization came just before dawn. Jacob stood at the edge of the dig site, watching the villagers work with a coordination that had not existed in Bitter Creek for a generation. He noticed something. The young men who had once bought matches daily from Ezra were now working beside their fathers, learning to read the quality of kindling, understanding the difference between green wood and cured, the way the ice could be shattered to reveal dry fuel beneath. The knowledge of fire, not just the spark but the whole ecology of it, was being transferred in real time under pressure in the cold dark. And it wasn't just the boy Benny learning from him. Everyone was learning from someone. The art was not one horn held by one man. It was a web of skills: fire starting, fuel management, heat retention, community logistics, that the pioneers had once possessed and nearly lost. The storm had destroyed the modern tools, but it had also exposed the hollowness of a society that relied on a single point of failure. The question now was not whether the town would survive the night. It would. The deeper question, the one Jacob saw flickering in the tired eyes of the villagers, was whether they would remember. When the snow melted and the rails reopened, and fresh boxes of matches arrived at the general store, would they revert to convenience and forgetfulness? Or had this night carved something permanent into the bones of the town? As the first gray light crept over the eastern ridge, Jacob walked slowly back toward his cabin. The empty horn hung from his neck by its leather cord. He could hear behind him the sounds of a village still working, axes splitting the rescued fuel, voices calling inventories, children being sent to check on the elderly. The storm was not over, but the spiral of helplessness had broken. And as he reached his own door, he found a small bundle left on the step, a block of dried birch bark, a coil of fine-shaved tinder, and a clay pot of rendered tallow, all tied with a strip of red yarn. No note, just the materials to start a new fire. Someone had understood. Inside, Jacob hung the horn on its hook above the cold hearth. He would fill it again, not with a borrowed ember, but with a new one struck the old way, from flint and char cloth, when the sun rose fully. And one day, perhaps soon, he would give it to the boy or to another, and the cycle would continue beyond his own years. The art that had lit the first fire in Bitter Creek 30 winters before had been given back, not gently, but violently, by a storm that stripped away every illusion of modern safety. The worst had happened, yes. The fuel was buried, the matches turned to paste, the village humbled. But in the very center of that wreckage, something new was already smoldering. Something that in the thaw would become the seed of a permanent change. Spring would reveal whether it had truly taken root. Spring came reluctantly that year. The ice did not melt so much as dissolve, thinning day by day, releasing its grip on the rooftops one dripping icicle at a time. Patches of bare earth reappeared along the south-facing slopes, dark and boggy, and the smell of wet pine needles rose from the forest floor like an old memory. The sawmill remained a collapsed hulk, but beside it, neat rows of salvaged cordwood now covered half the supply yard, cut and stacked by the same hands that had dug through the frozen wreckage in the dark. Jacob walked the thawed road on the first mild afternoon, the empty horn still hanging from its cord. He saw things he had never seen in 40 winters. A new woodshed behind the Miller cabin, roofed with fresh cedar shakes, its interior stacked with kindling sorted by size and dryness. A hand-painted sign nailed to the general store door. "We carry, ask inside." Ezra Bledsoe, who had sold 1,000 boxes of Lucifer matches, now kept an ash-lined horn on the counter next to the till, a coal smoldering inside. "One for display," he told anyone who asked, "and one for backup in the kitchen." Myra insisted. And then there were the children. On the muddy common in front of the chapel, a dozen of them gathered each afternoon after chores. Some as young as 7, others tall as their fathers, all holding small horns of their own, carved by an old cooper from Wisconsin who had settled near the creek, shaped from local ox bone and lined with birch ash exactly as Jacob had shown them. The boy Benny Caulfield stood at the center, no longer a frightened 13-year-old clutching borrowed fire, but a calm, confident teacher, correcting grips, demonstrating the slow breath that kept a coal alive without flaring it. Jacob watched from a bench under the old cottonwood, saying nothing. This was the moment he had not allowed himself to hope for. The art had become a school, and the school was running without him. But the deeper change took longer to reveal itself. It emerged not in public demonstrations, but in the small, private rituals of households that had once relied entirely on the general store for ignition. After the ice storm, no one wanted to be the family caught without a live ember. So they learned. Not just the children, but the mothers, the grandmothers, the taciturn farmers who had once scoffed. The knowledge spread through kitchen table conversations, through neighbors trading tips on ash consistency, through the quiet figure of Jacob walking from door to door with the same patience he had shown on the night of the storm, offering a single ember to any hearth that needed it, and then staying long enough to teach someone inside how to keep it going. One evening in late April, Reverend Plimpton called a town meeting in the chapel. The benches were full, not only the regular congregation but the trappers from the high ridges, the sawyers, the ranch hands. Plimpton opened with a prayer of thanks for survival, but his voice quickly turned to business. "We lost the mill roof," he said. "We lost most of the surplus fuel, but we didn't lose a single life. Not one. That's not luck, that's something else." He looked at Jacob, who sat in the back row, the old horn resting on his knee. "We all know how the fires got lit that night. But the question before us now is whether we stay dependent on the same fragile supply lines that nearly killed us. Do we wait for the next storm and the next batch of wet matches, or do we build something permanent?" The debate that followed lasted hours, sometimes loud, often raw. There were practical minds who argued that it was foolish to abandon modern convenience. A match was fast, clean, and inexhaustible when dry. But others, the ones who had carried lanterns at the mill, who had watched their children shiver before Jacob knocked, pushed back. They pointed to the new horns hanging in kitchens across the valley, to the children practicing in the common, to the growing stack of split kindling now stored in every home. Why choose between old and new? Why not keep the matches as backup and the horns as insurance? By the end of the meeting, no formal law was passed. No ordinance required the carrying of fire, but something more durable than law took hold, a consensus born of near death that this knowledge was too precious to abandon again. Every household agreed, with a simple show of hands, to maintain a live coal through the winter months, to teach the technique to their children when they came of age, and to contribute a small portion of milled kindling to a community stockpile stored in a new stone shed built beside the chapel. They called it the Ember Fund. Nels Hansen, whose daughter had been born healthy 2 days after the storm, carved the sign for the shed door. "Keep one for the neighbor." The ritual of the horn re-entered Bitter Creek's calendar with a quiet persistence. Every Sunday evening, families would walk to the chapel carrying their own glowing embers, and after the service, they would exchange a fragment with someone else, not out of need but as a gesture of continuity. The act was deliberately inefficient. It would have been easier to strike a new match, but that was precisely the point. The ritual made the value of dependence visible. It reminded everyone that fire was not a product to be consumed and discarded, but a living thing passed from hand to hand. And Jacob, observing all of this, slowly began to withdraw, not from the town but from the center of its attention. He had never wanted to be a hero, only a teacher. Now that the teaching had spread beyond his control, he returned to the quiet rhythms of his cabin, tending his own horn, splitting firewood, reading the winter almanacs. The townsfolk still greeted him with deference, but they no longer needed him urgently. That was, to Jacob, the truest measure of success. He was becoming unnecessary. Then, on a bright morning in early May, when the last snow had melted even in the North Hollows, an unexpected visitor arrived on the valley road. A young man, perhaps 25, dressed in a dusty canvas coat with Eastern tailoring, carrying a notebook and a leather satchel stamped with the seal of the Rocky Mountain Survey. His name was Edgar Thorne, a cartographer and ethnologist hired by the territorial government to document frontier practices before they disappeared. He had heard rumors, weeks old by now, of a settlement that still practiced the obsolete art of fire carrying, and he had ridden 3 days to see if the stories were true. He expected to find a handful of eccentric holdouts. What he found instead was a village where nearly every kitchen possessed a worked horn, where children could recite the proper ash mix by weight, and where a 13-year-old boy could teach a college-trained investigator how to breathe an ember from orange to yellow without burning his fingers. Thorne spent 2 weeks in Bitter Creek. He filled 3 notebooks with observations: the design of the horns, the species of wood preferred for slow coals, the generational lineage of the technique, the social rules that governed ember exchange. He sketched Jacob sitting on his porch, the old horn on his lap, the lines of his face etched by decades of silent service. He interviewed Benny Caulfield and recorded, word for word, the instructions Jacob had given on the night of the storm. Hold it against your heart. Breathe into it once lightly. If it pales, feed a twig no thicker than your finger. He collected statements from Widow Hester, from Ezra Bledsoe, from Bird singing the midwife, who told him in terse, measured English that fire was not a tool but a relative. One demanded respect and reciprocity, not convenience. The twist, the detail that startled even the people of Bitter Creek, emerged from Thorne's research in the weeks after he left. He had contacted the archives of the American Folklife Society and discovered a parallel tradition among a handful of isolated communities in the Appalachian Highlands and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Fire horns preserved, passed down, nearly extinguished by the spread of mass-produced matches in the 1860s. Jacob's family lineage, traced back to Saxony, was one branch of a much older diaspora, a network of keepers who had understood, long before the industrial age, that a single ember carried across a valley could mean the difference between survival and extinction. The specific variant practiced in Bitter Creek, with birch ash and ox horn, had been adapted to Rocky Mountain cold and the particular resin content of lodgepole pine. It was, Thorne wrote in his final report, a living piece of vernacular engineering, a distributed system of energy resilience that could teach modern planners something profound about decentralization and community memory. That report, published in 1881, would eventually find its way into a small academic journal, then into the library of a folk museum in St. Louis. But for the people of Bitter Creek, the recognition from outside mattered far less than the internal transformation. The spring after the storm, the number of horns in the valley had tripled. By the following autumn, every hearth possessed one, and the ember fund shed held dry fuel for any family that fell short. The children now learned to carve their own horns as part of their schooling, under the tutelage of the old cooper and the watchful eye of their parents. A generation that had been born into the certainty of matches grew up with the manual memory of carrying live coals, not because they had to, but because they understood that necessity could return at any hour, dressed in ice and silence. The final surprise, the one no one could have predicted, came in the form of a gift. On the first anniversary of the Great Ice Storm, December 7th, 1879, the village gathered at the chapel for a service of remembrance. After the singing and the prayers, Benny Caulfield, now 14 and already a head taller, stood before the assembly and produced from behind his back a new horn. It was not ox bone or carved horn. It was forged from copper, lined with porcelain ash, its exterior polished until it gleamed like a dark mirror. He had apprenticed with the tinsmith in the next valley for 6 months, learning to shape metal, specifically to create a vessel that could survive a hard fall, a crushing branch, a crack on frozen ground, the very vulnerabilities that had haunted Jacob on his walk through the ice. The copper horn held heat more evenly than bone, and its inner lining prevented the ash from scorching. It was, Benny explained quietly, still the same principle, still the same slow breath. But now the ember could travel farther, survive rougher conditions, and be passed to more homes without shrinking as fast. He had taken the art and, without betraying its essence, improved it. Then he walked to Jacob, knelt, and placed the copper horn in the old man's hands. "This one's for you," he said, "to use or just to keep, but I made it so that the fire you gave us would never go out." Jacob held the copper horn, heavy and warm even without an ember, and for the first time in anyone's memory, he wept. Not from weakness, but from the overwhelming certainty that the thing he had guarded his whole life had not only survived, it had grown stronger in hands other than his own. The central promise of that terrible night was now fulfilled. The lonely old man carrying a dying art had become a village that carried it together. The ember that had been mocked was now the foundation of a community resilience that no matchbox could ever replicate. As the crowd dispersed into the cold evening, each family returned to a home with a glowing hearth and a horn hanging beside the mantel. The sound of children practicing breath control drifted from open doorways. Somewhere, a baby cried, warm. And Jacob, walking slowly home with the copper horn cradled against his chest, could hear the entire valley humming with the quiet, steady rhythm of fire being passed along. The art that had nearly died in his hands now belonged to everyone, And that was the part no one, least of all Jacob, had seen coming. The storm had not buried the tradition. It had planted it. What happened in Bitter Creek did not remain in Bitter Creek. The Cooper's horns found their way to 3 neighboring settlements in the next 5 years. The tinsmith's copper design, refined over a dozen iterations, became a trade item that mountain families ordered even when the roads were clear and matches were cheap. It wasn't about necessity anymore. It was about not forgetting. Edgar Thorne's report, tucked into an academic journal, caught the attention of a folklorist in Massachusetts who began a wider study of fire-carrying traditions across the continent. She discovered at least 8 distinct styles: German, Scandinavian, Abenaki, Métis, each with its own ash formula, its own horn shape, its own protocol for how long an ember could rest before demanding breath. But Bitter Creek became the first documented case where the practice had been deliberately revived after nearly disappearing, a community-wide decision to unforget something valuable. The question worth asking now is not whether Jacob was a hero. He would have rejected that word. The question is what we lose when we hand survival over to systems we don't fully understand. A match is a very simple thing, but the chemical knowledge behind it belongs to factories, not to the hand that strikes it. A kerosene lantern is clean and bright, but its fuel comes from a barrel shipped from a refinery no frontier family ever saw. When those supply lines break, and they will break, whether by storm or distance or market collapse, the person who only knows how to buy fire is suddenly in the dark. Jacob knew how to make fire, carry it, share it, and teach it. Those are 4 distinct skills, and the modern world had collapsed them into one: purchase. The ice storm exposed the fragility in that collapse, but there's a more personal layer here. The fire horn was never just about heat. It was a social contract. When Jacob carried an ember to a frozen household, he was not performing a transaction. He was renewing a bond that stretched back to the old country and forward to the child not yet born. The ember was not a commodity. It was a guest, received with gratitude, passed with care. In a culture that increasingly treats everything as disposable, the idea that something can be kept alive through attention alone is quietly revolutionary. Every child who learned to breathe into a horn absorbed that lesson. Every family that hung a horn on the mantle made a silent promise: we will not be caught helpless again. And the twist, the one that continues to echo through the decades, is that the salvation of Bitter Creek didn't come from a new technology or an infusion of outside help. It came from an old man the town had decided to ignore, carrying a piece of folk engineering that had been dismissed as irrelevant. The very thing they mocked was the thing that saved them. In an age when we are constantly told that the future belongs to the young, and the new Bitter Creek suggests a different lesson, sometimes the future belongs to those who remember what the rest of us have forgotten. Jacob lived another 12 winters after the great ice storm. He saw the copper horn Benny made him become a model for a dozen more. He watched children he had taught grow into adults who taught their own children. When he finally passed, in the spring of 1891, the funeral procession stretched from the chapel to the ridge above the creek, and every person in it carried a lit horn. Smoke rose in 100 thin columns, and the sound of the wind through the pines was broken only by the slow, steady breathing of the living keeping the fire alive. He was buried with the copper horn on his chest, but the knowledge he guarded did not rest with him. It moved forward as all true knowledge does, from hand to hand, from breath to breath, from one generation to the next. Subscribe now to witness more forgotten stories of survival, ingenuity, and the quiet people who preserved the skills that built the world, before we lose them forever.